All right, folks, welcome back to copyright and licensing. So you'll recall from our previous classes, we were looking at history of copyright and um, ways to kind of simplify the equation, which would be, you know, the relationship between technology as something that pushes the law into a reactionary position. So you're seeing the law constantly coming up with new policies, new laws, new legislation after the fact. So if you know a certain type of very important technology came about in one year, then you add another 5 or so years to that, and that's the window that you'll probably find the laws that are starting to regulate that technology. So, it's a little bit of a recap here about, before we close the book completely on copyright. Copyright was never an issue before you had the first ability to actually duplicate somebody's expression, right? It's not just the original idea, it's the original expression of that idea. And so when you can retrieve that in a concrete form, now you've got issues. And so um, the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken, would be, so that's the 1400s, that would be the printing press. And so the Gutenberg press, here we've got an instrument of mass production that really wasn't an issue before that, because duplication of intellectual property, books primarily, was all done by hand. And so you've got monks and monasteries. They're preserving knowledge, or they're duplicating knowledge for the sake of preservation and instruction. And as we'll see later in the class, instruction is a protected sort of category. It's considered to be fair use to a certain extent. We did see the Teach Act last time as being one that posed problems to copyright owners, because educational sales represents a lot of potential income for book publishers. But once again, this is post mass distribution. And so the Gutenberg press really is that moment in time. If I'm not mistaken, it's either the 1300s or the 1400s. I really should know that, but Middle Ages in any case, late Middle Ages, when copyright as an issue starts to get pushed to the forefront of people's consideration. Because if you are depending just on monks copying everything by hand, then the loss of potential profit, right, is minimal, because you can only write so quickly. But when you start getting into the printing press and having the ability to rapidly duplicate books, now you've got an issue. So in England, in the 16th century and 17th century, you had what would be considered a censorship type of relationship with the distribution of intellectual property. And so anything that was printed at that point in time had to be printed with the stamp of the king, so with the privilege of the king. And the king had his own publishing company called the Stationers' Company, and they ensured that no ideas circulated that were contrary to what the king thought was right. And so the idea of external truth, or objective verification of what the truth was, does not apply and doesn't flourish in that type of situation where one person can say what is and is not the truth. It's one of the good things about our system of government, where if we have a president that's trying to be that person, you also have the judiciary, right, or the legislative branch. But in our recent case, the judiciary stepped up many times to sort of defend the truth and have an objective sense of what's going on. That wasn't the case in the 1600s and 1500s in England. Everything had to pass through the filter of what the king wanted to see or hear. And if it didn't, then it was underground literature, and um, oftentimes was a good way for people to, be executed. And so before people were burned, like dissidents, oftentimes their books went before them. So they would burn an author's book who had been published sort of underground, and that was the way to indicate to the author that better not be found, because you may be next in line getting burned at the stake there. So we've come a little bit of a ways there, thank goodness, but we still need the protection of copyright to ensure for not just a fair allocation of profit, but for ideas themselves to have the ability for to escape from censorship, really. So it does protect free speech. It's a system of protection for free speech, as well as fair distribution of profits back to creators. And so the distribution of the profit part, that's where we have the Statute of Anne. That's the first real bit of, after the Stationers' Company folded in the 1690s, now you've got 20 years later, the Statute of Anne comes up, where it says if you are the author, then you are also the owner. Okay, so those are some of the major sort of points about, copyright, what it means over time, the big kind of moments. And you'll recall as well, this is from the last classes, that you can see law reacting to the proliferation of the living stage in the 1860s with the protection of dramatic works. Shortly after motion pictures are in theaters are being produced, they are protected in 1912. Sound recordings is a little bit of an anomaly. Edison cylinder almost 100 years before that. But okay, so that's all review. Shifts in duration, we've seen that. That's what I want to focus on this point, is if the point of this lecture is why pay a lawyer $500 an hour to figure out when a work, to see if it's still copyrighted. If you are a potential user, you want to do a cover song, for example, recorded in the studio, do you have to send out mechanical licenses if it's a really old song? You're like, well, it's probably in the public domain. But you can't really make that assumption, because if you're wrong, even by a couple months or a year, then you are an infringer, and of course that's a federal crime, and it's a bad way to go down. Not quite as bad as being burned at the stake, but still not great. And so the point of this class is how to save you guys, paying hundreds of dollars per hour to figure out if a work is still protected or not. I'll give you the equations to do that. So we see that they ended up leaving it alone. In 2018, that was the Music Modernization Act. They did not push duration. They did not continue the trend of making duration longer and longer, interestingly enough. You do see this pattern of duration that's been extending. And you have to wonder about who's actually being protected in that situation. Clearly it's not the public, right? So copyright is also a balance of the rights of the public. When a work is no longer protected, it becomes their property. It's the public domain. And so the public benefits from shorter copyright periods. And so as copyright becomes longer and longer, the duration, it's the public that's essentially disenfranchised. And so who wins on that deal? Well, it's the owner, right? The copyright owner works. And initially their work was, protected by 14 years, and now it's up to their entire lifetime, plus another, 70 years. And so when you recognize that it's less private owners and more corporations that are in this position of ownership, now you can start to see the relationship of, get an idea, at least in my estimation, of why we have this trajectory of copyright protection, period of protection, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's because the powerful corporations are in a lobbying position because they want to keep that income stream happening, right? And so they don't want their works to go into the public domain because it means that no one will have to pay to use them anymore. And so we're less and less in a situation where publishing companies are owned by individuals, and more in a situation where publishing companies are owned by large entertainment conglomerates like Universal Music Group, for example, or Warner Chappell, or Sony, or whomever. And so that's one angle. That's the interpretation I use of why we have duration all the time expanding. It's because it's no longer a question of individual ownership, but corporate ownership, and they have the power and the financial means to protect their lucrative, streams of income. So when you're trying to figure out, okay, you've got this song that's interesting, and you want to use it, you want to duplicate it, do a version of it, cover it, or use it for a sample. Can you do that for free? Right? That's the big question. And so, yes, you can do it if the copyright has expired. And so then the question is, well, when did it expire, and how do I actually figure that out? So interestingly, you'll notice this 14 plus 14, or 14 plus 28. The plus in the middle there means renewal. Okay, so renewal term was an original idea that if your work is still making money after X amount of years, you can get it to extend the protection. Well, that whole idea was abolished in 1964. And so at that point in time, any unrenewed works went right into the public domain. And so that's an interesting sort of wrinkle here when you're trying to figure out if a work is still protected or not. Now, the law, the 1976 law, was the first major sort of overhaul of copyright law since 1909. And that basically divided all copyrighted protected works into two categories. One of which was works created after the law goes into effect, January 1st of 1978, and then everything before that. And so what I'd like to recommend you do now is to get your the copyright worksheet that's due this week. And you can see that we've already answered some of these questions here. So this first section of, matching, right? So number one, is that A, B, C, D, or E? So in 1790, what was the duration of copyright protection in 1790? Well, it was the smallest amount, right? That's the earliest date. So all this is chronological. One is 1790, two is 1831. And so one must be C, 14 plus 14. And what about 1998? Well, then it has to be the longest, right? Which is life plus 70. Okay, so I want to make sure that you can fill out this document as you're moving along here. We've already just reviewed that. You can see, in fact, all these are over to the left right now. Okay, and then the two main, the effect of the 76 law is that it divides copyrighted works into two main groups. Those created 1978 or after, and earlier is the second group. So number two would be all other works, or basically pre-78. 78 and after for one, pre-78 for the other one. Okay, so this idea of solving duration problems, and that's what this worksheet is all about here on the right. Okay, I'm giving you a bunch of duration problems, or 10 duration problems. And so this second section here, Roman numeral 2, is going to allow you to understand the equation of how to actually solve these problems, right? This is the $500 equation. Now, copyright law and figuring duration can be very complicated. You need much more than this. But we're just going to focus on US based works. And we're also we happen to be the most complex. That kept us out of the Berne Convention for quite some time, until 1989, until we simplified things. And so the 76 law goes a long way into simplifying things. And we're only going to focus on published as opposed to non-published work, which non-published works have a different sort of calculation required to do that. So we're interested in the United States and works that are published. And so you got to remember a couple things here. So it's not just all pre-78 works that are in the second group. It's really 1923 through 1977, because all works that were published before 1923 have expired. And so those are public domain works. And this is another bit of good news, is that all works after 1977, and so that's the effect of the 1976 law, goes into effect January 1st, 1978. So we're after 1977. Those are all the life of the author plus 70 years. And so we're really just interested in what's going on between 1923 and all the way through 1977. Okay, also remember another pointer is that work for hire and Circle P, so records, audio recordings, are, there's a different sort of math there we'll get to in a second. Okay, so we're looking at this short period of time between 1923 and 1977, or through 1977. And so these two groups here, okay, go back over to the document. The two main groups are pre-1978. Those are the ones that are difficult. And the post-1978 ones are easy. And their renewal period is simply the life of the author plus 70 years. I mean, not renewal, but protection period. You can recall the renewal period has been eliminated by the time we get to 78. Okay, so figuring out the duration of any work that's made since 1978 is easy, right? It's just simply life plus 70. If it happens to be a work for hire, then it's 95 years from publication or 120 years from creation, whichever one lasts longer. So we'll remember that, because I will ask you about work for hire. Okay, so you want to write that down. Okay, other pointers. All answers are going to go throughout the year. When you figure out the year that it expires, it's not going to expire on the date that it was published, but it'll go to the end of that year. So 12/31 is the answer for the year of expiration. Unpublished works, for your information, I won't ask you about these, but are all basically life plus 70. And, if they died more than 70 years ago, they are now public domain, but that's just for your information. Okay, so let's look at these three subgroups. Okay, I'm asking for three subgroups of the earlier works. So this would be through 1977. Okay, the first one and most recent one is 1964 through 1977, and those are going to be at 95 years. So go over here and write 64 through 77, and those are 95 years. And then the second group is 1950 through 1963, and those depend on renewal. So it's 95 years if they were renewed, and 28 years if they were not renewed, because you'll remember going up here, 1909 is E, 28 plus 28, and that's the time period that we're looking for here. Okay, so that's the answer to number 3 is 28 plus 28. And then for the old ones, 1923 through 1949, right, up until 1950, Basically, if they are still protected, so you've got to do the math on renewal, right? 28 or 56. If they're not renewed, it's 28 years. If they're renewed, it's 56. If they're still protected by the time of the stroke of midnight of the end of 12/31/76, then that's 95 years protection. Otherwise, the date of the expiration is the date of expiration. It's either 28 years or 56 years, depending on renewal. Okay. Okay, so now what you do, you've got all of this filled out. Now what you do is simply do number 3. And this is what I want for you to submit on Canvas. It's multiple choice, 10 questions. And you just write the number 1 is A, B, C, or D, number 2, etc., just like we did before. Okay, so this is what you're going to turn in. So I'm not going to solve these for you, obviously, but I will solve some sample problems over here. Okay, so let's imagine we've got a work published. This is an old one. Okay, it's 1924. July 24th, 1924. It's not been renewed. Okay, we can recognize this is a pre-78 work, obviously, so it's not Life Plus 70 automatically. You might want to see my beautiful face again. 1978, pre-78 work, and it's subgroup 3. So let's go back and check out what subgroup 3 looks like. Okay, there it is. Works published before 1950, if they're still protected on the stroke of midnight, by 77, then it's 95 years. Otherwise, it just depends on their regular expiration date. And so it's not renewed. So that's 28 years. All right, good, got it. And so we do 1924 plus 28 equals 1952. So it's July 24th, 1924. Is this the answer? It must be, right? It's 28 years. Oh, that's right. It goes through New Year's Eve, 1952. So that is the answer, 12/31/1952. All right, let's do another one. Work published August the 1st, 1972, but not renewed. Well, you know what? Don't fall for the renewal versus not renewal for a work that's that recent, because renewal was abolished in 1964. So it doesn't matter. This is straight up 95 years all day long, because this is subgroup 1 pre-78 work, which means that when we go back to the previous slide, these are pre-78 works. Subgroup 1, published between 64 and 77. That's our work. That's our time period. And the answer is just add 95 years. Okay, 95 years after publication, renewal not a factor. It's August 1, 1972, plus 95 years equals 2067. The answer is 12/31/2067. Okay, so that's how you do this worksheet. And so that's what I'm looking for your assignment this week. We will work on the pipeline afterwards. You're going to need this moving forward, but don't worry about subsection 4. Just do subsection 3 and send me the answers. And remember, the last one is a true-false question. All right. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you all very much. I hope everybody's doing okay. And we will be in touch.